Since people were first kidnapped from Africa and brought to this country, enslaved, millions and millions of African Americans have suffered enormously from physical and other kinds of violence. During the 1950s and the 1960s, in the civil rights movement, many African Americans were killed or terrorized by white people who did not want our country's racial caste system to change. A few white men were also killed in this struggle, and one white woman gave her life. She was Viola Liuzzo, a 39-year-old Unitarian Universalist laywoman from Detroit. She was one of two Unitarian Universalists killed in the bloody spring of 1965. The other was Reverend James Reeb, killed a couple of weeks before Viola. Viola Liuzzo's death marks the point where several stories converge. One of these is the long story of white America's racism towards African Americans and the civil rights movement that African Americans undertook to overturn that system. The second is the story of a white working class person who grew up in the segregated South, a Unitarian Universalist convert whose life was transformed by her closest friend, a black woman named Sarah Evans. And finally, the third story. The third story is that one, that slowly evolving one, about the differing expectations we have for men and women working out in the world. Expectations about who may work, as Marge Percy put it in the reading, who may work in the mud and the muck to move things forward. These are three wonderful stories. I hope they'll inspire us all. I'll begin with a little bit of the civil rights movement. On March 25th, 1965, the civil rights movement celebrated one of its greatest triumphs. On that day, 25,000 people finally succeeded in marching into Montgomery, Alabama, from the nearby city of Selma. The march into Montgomery was part of a much larger struggle, as most of us know. It had been going on all over the country, as well as in the Selma-Montgomery area. Over and over, black citizens had attempted to register to vote in Selma, starting in the 1950s, and the efforts were continually blocked by white officials through literacy tests, by the white business community through economic pressure, and by the white, mainly working Ku Klux Klan through violence. As a result, in 1961, only 1% of the African Americans in the county surrounding Selma had the right to vote, were registered to vote. So protests began. In 1965, there was a protest march near Selma. Alabama troopers attacked people and killed one of them, a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson. It was his death that sparked this whole Selma to Montgomery attempted march, the four-day march that drew Viola Liuzzo down to Alabama. It wasn't easily accomplished. After Martin Luther King called for an attempt to march to Montgomery to channel black citizens' anger into a nonviolent protest and to confront Governor Wallace directly, civil rights marchers gathered and they set off on March 7th. But as they crossed the bridge on the outside of Selma, troopers again met protesters and they beat them, bloodied them. What was different this time is that there were reporters there. There were television cameras. So all across the nation, people saw pictures of Alabama state troopers beating brutally peaceful, unarmed marchers, old people, young people, women and children. Viola Liuzzo was horrified also by the images she saw on television. And she said, "I had to come to Selma because of the brutality. I didn't see how anyone could keep from coming." Once that happened, the bloody beating, Dr. King immediately called for people to come down to the Selma area and march again, to try to march again from Selma to Montgomery. At that point, 3 white ministers who had responded to his king were then attacked and beaten with clubs. One of those was James Reeves, a Unitarian Universalist minister who died a couple of days after he was beaten. A few days after Reeves' death, the marchers tried again. This time, they were escorted by federal troops. And for 4 days, they marched through rain and they camped in muddy fields. Day by day, the crowd grew, and then finally, on March 25th, 25,000 people marched into Montgomery and up to the steps of the state capitol building. Viola Liuzzo, the Unitarian Universalist, was one of those people. Now, she'd been born in 1925. She grew up poor in the segregated South. Her father was a coal miner and her mother a school teacher. They lived in unheated shacks and they moved around often after her father had lost his hand in a mining accident. At 16, Viola left high school and got married. The marriage lasted 1 day. She was marrying to get out of the house, it looks like. 2 years later, she married again. And a week after her second wedding, at age 18, she met the person who would become her closest friend, Sarah Evans, a black woman. After Viola had her first 2 children in her second marriage, Sarah started babysitting them while Viola worked as a waitress. Sarah and Viola remained close for the rest of Viola's life. Through Viola's divorce after 7 years of marriage, through her remarriage to Jim Liuzzo, a union organizer for the Teamsters, through the birth of Viola's next 3 children, through Viola's return to school part-time after many years, Sarah Evans worked as the family's babysitter. In 1963, Viola enrolled at the Wayne State University in Detroit. And through Sarah Evans, her longtime African-American friend, she began to get involved in the civil rights movement. She became active in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She became involved with the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Detroit. And in 1964, she and her friend Sarah drove to New York City to be a part of a seminar on civil rights sponsored by the Unitarian Universalist Association. Viola seems to have been a good fit for Unitarian Universalism, although she started off and went through a number of other faith traditions before she ended up with us. Her voluminous FBI file contains a poem she wrote in 1964 that ended with these lines: "Truth is not Christian, Jewish, Hindu, or Buddhist. What is true for one man is true for all men." She was deeply disturbed by how women and African Americans were treated, and she was probably inspired by several congregants from her Detroit church who had gone on freedom rides in the South in prior years. After that bloody attack in Selma, Viola decided to go to Alabama. Her husband tried to dissuade her, but in the end, he said that if she felt it was that important, she should go. Viola arranged for Sarah Evans and her oldest daughter, Penny, to care for her other children, and she wrote out their schedules for the day. She made arrangements to take her Wayne State final exams after she returned. Then, Viola drove her car to Selma. In Selma, she marched. She ferried people around in her car for the march. She helped out at a nursing station. There's a photo of Viola, which is reprinted on your order of service, marching in the crowd toward Montgomery on the last day, barefoot and carrying her shoes, probably because of blisters, like so many other marchers. She looks very determined. She called her family that day, right after the march, telling them it was over, that she'd be coming home now. Before she drove back to Detroit, though, Viola helped out for a few more hours. With her suitcase already in her car, she shuttled marchers back to Selma from Montgomery. After dropping off the passengers, she and her co-driver, a young African-American named Leroy Moten, headed back to Montgomery to pick up more marchers. They never arrived. Out on the highway, a car filled with Ku Klux Klan members pulled up alongside her. The mother of 5 from Detroit, who had come to Alabama to support voting rights for all Americans, was shot twice. She died instantly. Immediately afterwards, her death transfixed the nation. President Johnson got personally involved in the murder case. At her funeral, Dr. Martin Luther King and other dignitaries and leaders extolled her bravery and her selflessness. The acclamation didn't last long, though. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, had an informant in the car of the Klansmen who murdered Viola Liuzzo that night. To protect his bureau, Hoover immediately began putting out smears about Liuzzo and insinuations. And within days, the portrayal of Viola Liuzzo in the press went from that of a brave, unselfish worker for freedom to a woman who had left her children, probably used drugs, come to Alabama to have sex with black men, and was married to a mobster. She was no longer a good woman. Up north, her broken-hearted family faced reprisals, even as they dealt with her loss. There were bullets through their windows and garbage dumped at the house, crosses burned at their front lawn. Viola Liuzzo was quickly forgotten in the press and in our denomination, while the sacrifices of Reverend Reeb, Jimmy Lee Jackson, and other men were not forgotten. The smears that Hoover put out don't fully explain this. Another factor is our gendered responses then and now to her death. People asked, how could a mother leave her children at home for a week, even if there was someone taking care of them? Especially to go where there was the possibility of violence. How could she risk it? She must not have really cared about her children. She must not have been a good mother. She wasn't really a good person. And so the public believed the smears and the insinuations because both smears and gender assumptions led to the same conclusion, that she wasn't a good person. Reverend James Reeb, it's interesting, the Unitarian Universalist minister who had died 2 weeks before, he had 4 children. His fitness as a parent, his self-sacrifice for his goodness as a person were not questioned in the press. The Reeb family was showered with love after his death, and admirers set up scholarships for his children. The UUA put up a memorial plaque the next year with the names of Reeb and 2 of the other men who were killed in that Selma struggle. There was no plaque for Viola, no scholarships for her children. In the political realm, the story has a happy ending. The Selma Montgomery marches and the violence associated with them, including Viola Liuzzo's murder, shifted public opinion radically about the civil rights movement and had a powerful effect in Washington. By summer, the Federal Voting Rights Act had passed, and it prohibited most of the practices that had been used to keep African Americans from voting. And thankfully, Liuzzo's place in our Unitarian Universalist movement has been recovered and her sacrifice honored. In 1999, a commemorative plaque bearing her name, along with James Reeb's, was placed in the Unitarian Universalist Association's headquarters. Honoring her is important, in part because she was so ordinary. She was a lay person. She was a new Unitarian Universalist, a mother of 5, in school part-time. And her decision to go to Selma was brave. She was ordinary and brave, just like every one of the 25,000 people who marched into Montgomery that day. They were all brave, doing dangerous and yet ordinary work, walking, as Marge Piercy, our poet, put it, in the mud and the muck to move things forward. doing what had to be done again and again. Viola, like all those other marchers, didn't want to die. She wanted to help out and then go back home to her family. But she lost her life doing this justice work, and today, as we honor Dr. Martin Luther King, we can also honor one of our own Unitarian Universalists, Viola, and her sacrifice and her life as one of the many that were given during the struggle led by Dr. Martin Luther King. Honoring her is important, too, because she was a woman and a mother. And justice calls us to affirm that women and men are not solely defined by gender and their family roles. And she's inspiring, too, because of how she lived. She's a role model for white allies who find themselves in similar situations, rebalancing and balancing their commitments to their family and living out their values. And finally, her life gives us the key to one of the strongest ways that we can be transformed into people who are really agents for positive change, for loving change in the lives of others. And the key to this transformation, her 20-year relationship with Sarah Evans. That friendship, it seems clear, allowed her to grow into the committed ally that she became. It really matters who we become friends with. My friends, may we each be inspired to reach out and connect deeply with people who are different from ourselves, whoever we are. May we honor men and women when they sacrifice for justice in the world. And may we be inspired by the words from Adrienne Rich's poem, to touch our own passion, to make and make again where unmaking reigns. We have lived with violence so long. Let us, too, cast our lot with those who refuse to be a victim, with those who, age after age, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. Amen. Blessed be.